listen, they could be ISIS. I don't know.
This is a political ideology that is not compatible with our culture, our way of life.
It started in the 1980s with family reunion or unskilled Muslim migration to Western Sydney.
Many of the individuals, including the individual responsible for the attack in Parramatta, are refugees.
A boat believed to be carrying 105 asylum seekers has capsized north of Christmas Island.
The boats have stopped.
People who come illegally by boat will not be granted permanent residency.
Critics insist that Canberra is ignoring basic human rights and is trampling over international law.
The boats have stopped.
About 80 asylum seekers from Afghanistan are in police custody tonight after they broke out of the Immigration Detention Centre in Darwin.
The boats have stopped.
Asylum seekers on Christmas Island have been sewing their lips together in protest of the length of their detention.
The boats have stopped. The boats have stopped.
On November the 21st, 1929, in the small Greek village of Vari, Kefalonia, my grandfather was born. He was charismatic, cheeky, and I think the best way to describe him would be alive. In 1956, he came to Australia. His ship was to dock at Fremantle, but there were too many protesters throwing tomatoes at the oncoming boat. He loved his animals, so after he arrived, bought a farm in Bridgenorth Road, Lagana. My grandfather came here with just a few dollars in his pocket and got a job at Bronte Park fixing the water pipes. But his work ethic was so high that soon him and my family were living comfortably. He sacrificed everything to come to Australia, leaving his parents and homeland behind just so he could build a better life for his family. This is why I am here today. The reason why I am in Australia is because my grandfather came here with a suitcase and a dream. This is the reason why I am passionate about asylum seekers and refugees. The journey of a migrant does not even compare to the perilous journey of a refugee or asylum seeker, but their stories almost intertwine once they arrive on Australian shores. Every single ethnic minority group has been marginalised and ostracised, and my grandfather experienced this racism firsthand. Migrants are the building blocks of Australia and have created a country so vibrant with colour and culture. Whether they come by ship, plane, or rickety fishing boat, are no burden, no threat, but an opportunity for Australia to flourish and prosper. So, what actually is an asylum seeker or refugee? Well, in the midst of a migration crisis, the words refugee, migrant, and asylum seeker have been thrown around a whole lot, and I'm sure you've heard them being used rather interchangeably by the media. Interchangeably is defined as of two or more things capable of being put or used in the place of each other. But these three words turn out to have profound variances in their meaning and are vastly unrelated in the associated facts and figures, as well as legal implications. Migrant. A migrant is a person who travels from one location or country to another in seeking a better life. They may be travelling for an economical purpose, such as an opportunity for a new job, or a general seek for a more economically viable standard of living. Some may migrate as solely a lifestyle choice, such as the need to reconnect with family, to study overseas, or the simple desire for a more relaxing regime. People may also migrate to another area to escape war or oppression. But this is where the definition diverges to the word refugee. A refugee, similar to an asylum seeker, is someone who's been forced to flee their home as a result of conflict, political oppression, religious discrimination, or natural disaster. The 1951 Refugee Convention states that a refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. These people cannot go back to their homes as they risk their welfare, freedom, and ultimately their lives. They, however, unlike asylum seekers, have already applied for refugee status with the United Nations while still overseas, this usually taking place in a refugee camp in the bordering country to which they escaped. Refugees have had their application accepted, been legally processed as genuine refugees, and have been granted asylum. An asylum seeker, however, is someone who is either currently travelling to another place to escape their home, or someone who has applied for asylum but is pending a verdict on their application. They are unprocessed individuals who have either fled through people smugglers without the possession of any identification documents or are waiting in a refugee camp to be accepted. These people are the ones splashed across the front page of the newspapers, broadcasted upon every news channel available, and kicked from Tony Abbott to Julia Gillard, to Malcolm Turnbull, to Bill Shorten, to Kevin Rudd as a political football. So, why does the media call the people on our own shores asylum seekers or boat people? But those same human beings, migrants, on European shores? Well, it's all about perception, and the media is very crafty in the way of which they mould an image, clip, or piece of information into anything they would like you to view it as. Boat people are bad for Australia. Dirty immigrants that take our jobs, money, and reap the benefits. But migrants are families and children fleeing oppression and torture. These are the same people, Australia. Language is a crucial tool for legitimising political agendas, and the media sure knows how to use language to distort and craft a desired perception. The biggest problem in our society is we, as human beings, inadvertently accept and rely on information given to us by those of which we believe are of higher regard. The media, the government, the educated news reporters of Southern Cross. We unconsciously have faith in those who we think are trusted members of society and are professionals in their field. But just because the media is the dominant voice ringing in our ear, it doesn't mean that it's the right voice or the fair voice. The media does not examine and scrutinise an issue, but reaps and collates favourable data to fabricate a desired story. Being informed is truly the most powerful way to decipher and comprehend the truth behind today's mixed messages. 20 years after perhaps the most illustrious maiden speech in Australian history,
I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians.
Pauline Hanson is back, and on September the 4th, 2016, burst on the political scene with this dead ring of 1996.
Now we are in danger of being swamped by Muslims. Have no doubt that we will be living under Sharia law and treated as second-class citizens. Then I suggest you go back where you came from. I will take you to the airport and wave you goodbye with sincere best wishes.
Many agree, whereas many don't. But either way, Pauline Hanson is a walking, talking representation of Australia's immigration past. She personifies, with uncanny precision, Australia's knack to hate and be objectionable of an arriving race, and then to simply learn to deal with them, completely forget about them, and move on to the next arriving ethnic group. After the abolition of the White Australia policy, people began to arrive from Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Every single one of those ethnic groups have been feared, marginalised, and been subjected to deportation. Wherever you're from, whether you're a migrant, asylum seeker, or refugee, Pauline Hanson and Australia have an instinctual mistrust of outsiders, and one that is inscribed very deep in our history. The escalation of voters and rise of Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party is confirmation of Australia's growing terror of international integration and globalisation. But are we just scared of globalisation? I mean, we hated the Greeks when they first came here, and then we hated the Chinese, But what is it about Muslims that one nation taps into oh so cunningly? Terrorism. One nation feeds off fear. On September the 11th, 2001, 4 airliners carried out suicide attacks and flew into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Over 3,000 people were killed. This is where the fear campaign began.
Sam, I'm so upset by all this again. Here we have another attack in Australia. People are in fear on our streets, and terrorism that has touched our shores. Now we are in danger of being swamped by Muslims who bear a culture and ideology that is incompatible with our own. We still have more mosques going up in this country. Antisocial behaviour is rampant. And in sections of the Quran, I will tell you this, 4.84 Surah, fight. Muslims are imprisoned at almost 3 times the average rate. No more Muslims in Australia. No more Muslim refugees in Australia.
Listen, terrorism is real and scary, but there are other things that are too. The media simply does not name up the non-Muslim terror attacks as terrorism. Articles and TV montages about killer foreigners play better than a story about a guy who goes into a South Carolina church and kills 9 people. That's just called a tragedy. The media makes an issue black and white. And of course everyday Aussies are going to understand and resonate with the story of the good white guy and the scary brown Muslim.
Yet another story of Christian terrorist who walks into an abortion clinic, at this time in Kansas, with a bomb. So you've been seeing it 24/7 on Fox News, obviously. Oh, you haven't? I mean, it must be all over the rest of the media, right? I mean, when you go on CNN, they're probably talking about this as much as they talked about any Muslim walking into a place with a bomb, right? No?
There have been plenty of Christian terrorists, but they don't sell as well. Because being a Christian nation, we don't want to look at the villain as being of our colour or within our country. That's the same reason why America doesn't make a big fuss about the 30 Americans killed daily by gun violence. Muslim terrorism. Muslim terrorism. 2 words that have become synonymous in the global media fear campaign.
I'd just like to say that you're in a position now where you can make a change. I think you should use that position positively instead of driving this fear amongst the community.
Our objection to asylum seekers is built on this foundation of fear. Fear of attacks on our streets, fear of losing our national pride, and fear of losing our jobs to an arriving immigrant. Christos Tsiolkas said, regardless of where you stand with the asylum seeker debate, we all know that even if every single boat was stopped, if they were all sent back into Indonesian waters, if we put all those on board into camps in a deprived satellite nation, if we exterminated the whole lot of them, every blighted man, woman and child, none of this would speed up the 2-hour drive on choked roads that we take to and from work, boost the numbers of nurses and doctors in our public hospitals, make our education system any better, or increase wages, the dole of our pension payments. We all know this, but we don't accept it, and this is the reason why we have such tough border policies. I spoke to Ross Hart, the federal member for Bass in Tasmania, as well as Andrew Dawkins, the Greens member for Bass. They were great people to talk to and gave me an incredible insight into the different perspectives surrounding the asylum seeker debate.
The current policy is that if somebody arrives by boat, they will be processed in offshore detention and their claim for asylum will be determined on that basis. We believe that people should be humanely processed. Their claims for refugee status should be determined as quickly as possible, and they should be resettled in a third-party country. Labor doesn't believe that indefinite detention should form any part of a deterrent against maritime arrivals. We don't believe that we should be putting the people smugglers back in business. That's why we need to deal with the question of whether people can resettle in Australia as a consequence of their acceptance of their claims.
Well, our current policy is clearly that we don't accept any asylum seekers coming by boat. We use the UNCHR system, and I think it's 13,750, increasing over the next couple of years. I think Australia has completely dropped the ball when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers. There are over 60 million refugees in the world now. The biggest movement of people in human history. This is something that if we continue to use as a political football, we are going to create generations of people who are displaced, who have no sense of their own home and have no sense of community or belonging, which is the worst thing that we could do to the world. There has to be better alternatives to offshore processing. The conditions that people live in Nauru and Manus Island are incomparable, I think, to anything in Australia.
Operation Sovereign Borders is the Australian government's military-led scheme to stop the boats. It is the government's response to the migration crisis and is to, quote, combat people smuggling and protect Australia's borders. Policy procedures include turning back the boats and providing financial support to the third-party country of which the boats are being turned back into, arranging for the immediate return of all passengers, increasing the capacity of offshore detention centres, purchasing and arraying vessels to tow back asylum seekers to a third-party country or back to where they came from, denying those in offshore detention resettlement in Australia, even if found out to be genuine refugees. These third-party and unfortunately third-world countries are not capable of taking care of such a displaced mass of people and simply do not have the financial or infrastructural capacity to create an environment that meets constitutional human rights. Operation Sovereign Borders is constantly under scrutiny and is faced with relentless criticism from the UNHCR, they stating that the, quote, legal framework and physical conditions for the detention and treatment of asylum seekers remain below international standards and, overall, do not provide for a safe, fair and humane standard of treatment. Children have also found themselves tangled within the web of Australia's offshore processing system. Children. And this detaining of minors, and often unaccompanied minors, is somehow permissible under Australian law. The trauma of mandatory and indefinite detention is incalculably damaging to a child's welfare. These kids have been prevented from entering Australian borders by boat turnbacks and have been imperiled to further threats at sea, possibly brought back to the horrifying war zone of which they desperately fled, or returned to conditions, such as third-party processing centres, that do not, under any circumstance, provide security and protection. Article 31 of the Refugee Convention states that refugees have a lawful right to enter a country for the purposes of seeking asylum, regardless of how they arrive or whether they hold valid travel or identity documents. Article 31 forbids countries from enacting punishments on refugees who are arriving in a country or are currently in a country without approval. Australia's offshore detention policy directly breaches Article 31 in the way of which we discriminate against offering places to boat arrivals and apply the label illegal on an obviously legal act. The United Nations has found the offshore processing system to be in breach of Article 9 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which prohibits people from being detained in arbitrary detention. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights blatantly forbids arbitrary detention. Arbitrary detention is detention when it is unjust or dangerous to one's welfare. The UN believes it is, quote, a gross violation of human rights and in the same category as torture and genocide. So, is Australia's detention of asylum seekers arbitrary? Well, detention is arbitrary if it is compulsory for a stereotyped category of individuals, for instance, people coming via boat, children are detained, individuals are imprisoned without consideration of their physical or mental condition, its health and safety standards are not constantly validated by a court, detention is not fixed to a legislated time limit. By this UN definition, Australia's compulsory and indefinite detention is arbitrary detention. Australian offshore processing system is, in reality, directed by political motivation rather than a drive to combat the migration crisis and find a financially viable, sustainable and compassionate way to help those of which are in need.
I think it's completely untrue. It's wrong. It's not. Doesn't fit with international law. There's nobody in the world that's illegal. Even if you've committed the most heinous crime, you're not illegal. You're a person who's going through a process to be punished for that. The way that we choose to use language around refugees and asylum seekers in Australia pains most good-thinking people.
It shouldn't form any part of the conversation because, as I know as a lawyer, that there is nothing illegal about seeking asylum. A refugee has the right to claim asylum under international law, and therefore my view is that illegal forms no part of the conversation. We need to have a different level of conversation about the use of that word. That word does not play any part in determining whether somebody is an asylum seeker or a refugee. No, I don't believe that's the case, but we need to recognise that sometimes there are fears, particularly in certain sectors of the community, that an immigrant may take somebody's job or may not contribute to our society. Now, I have absolute confidence that the history of immigration in Australia has been to add to Australia's society, add to the well-being of our communities.
I think it's based on fear. I mean, conservative politics is dogged by the idea of divide and conquer. We are dividing the population of Australia based on the fear of the other coming. We've been through this before, and we've, as a community, we've been able to pull together and offer compassion, open our hearts to people who need help. I think the current system and the current policies around asylum seekers is doing nothing for the Australian community. We are a community of people who have come by sea.
Bonding over a common interest of soccer, I met with Shanash, an Eritrean refugee that had travelled the perilous journey to Australia at just 9 years old. I was amazed by his journey and am so privileged that I was there to listen to his story.
My country of origin is Eritrea. It's an East African country that is very small. I was nine years old when I left there. What was the hardest part? We were one of the first people that flee from our country, because the border, it was so guarded that it was almost impossible to flee out. The only people that could flee out was the soldiers, because they had so much experience. For my mum to flee out with us, with dad being outside, it was pretty hard, but we did it anyway. It was a big risk. We had to go to Ethiopia, which is the neighbor country, and then from there, after a year and a half, UNHCR, they basically fed us, they kept us, and they gave us tent and everything that we needed until we went to a country. So we had a choice to go to Canada, Australia, America, New Zealand. I think it was just them, and then we chose Australia. Oh, it helped us a lot. Obviously, the lifestyle here is so much better, and you have so much more jobs. You have so much more security. You can rely on the government. So it gave us everything that we needed. Once a month or every week, sometimes we gather around other people that's from that country, and we just do what we used to do in our country. I think that's it. I coach actually 3 things. Is under 7s, which I coached last year, and I coached them this year too. They're under 9 now. I coach this Sudanese girls team. They called Black Angel. We made a team last year, and it's been going well. We got a sponsor now, So that worked out very well, and I also have a little habit seeing people that from my country play. The language, different kind of food, until we were able to make our own food. The culture obviously is different, the way that people act, what they do, how they do. You'd have to get used to that. That was different, that was challenging, but we got over it. They came here, obviously it was a different culture. It's like going from here, like for a white person, it's like going from Australia, going to our country. It's completely different, even though the lifestyle, they have so much security and there's freedom, nothing will ever happen to you, but the culture and the language, it's pretty hard. Australia's good.
Well, the Greens policy is to increase it to 50,000 a year, and for all the reasons that I've stated before, if we don't start to become a part of the solution to the migration of people from Europe and from Africa, we are going to be a part of the problem, and I don't want that for our community. I want to see that Australians are able to understand the current global conditions and to be able to change our policy to reflect that.
Well, the Labor Party believes there needs to be a significant increase in the refugee intake. We'll be dealing with both the push factors and the pull factors. We believe if you have a significant increase in the refugee intake, we're dealing with the flow of refugees into Southeast Asia. It's very important that we comply with our international obligations. We also believe that immigration of itself is something that's good for our community. We believe that it will drive economic growth, and we have obligations in the international community to accept flow of refugees. I can tell you that if our care or treatment of asylum seekers or refugees in offshore detention causes mental illness or causes any illness or disease, we need to be very concerned about that. Again, we should not be using indefinite detention as a deterrent. We must deal with these people humanely and compassionately. We need to process their claims, and we need to engage with the international community to achieve a resettlement.
If you're told that you're illegal, that you have no future in the country that you were trying to get to, and not only that, but that a third party country like New Zealand, who is willing to take you, that the Australian government would not let that happen. How could anybody not be suffering from anxiety or from mental health issues? I mean, even in a country like Australia, that mental health issues are rife. My partner's a mental health professional. I mean, the stories that he comes home with every day are absolutely harrowing. So amplify that in a situation where you're detained indefinitely, and we can only imagine that the horror that people are living through. Yeah, that's the pointiest end of it all, isn't it? That's intolerably cruel. So you've managed to get yourself out of your country, you've managed to get yourself to a third country. I heard a story where a young woman was in South Sudan, was at the point of being sold into sex slavery. She managed to get herself to Malaysia, where she found an office, a United Nations office. She went there and said, I need to seek asylum. They said, come back in 2.5 years. That's when the first appointment will be made available to you. So for 2.5 years, she would have to live in a refugee camp with no hope of being resettled.
Well, both major political parties have committed to the principle that there must be third-party resettlement. The Labor Party believes that we need to engage with the UNHCR and with the international community to achieve third-party resettlement.
I travelled to the vibrant metropolitan of Melbourne. Consistently rated as one of the world's most livable cities, Melbourne is a place alive with colour and culture. It is a city entangled with laneways and alleys, where the landscape is brimming with cutting-edge architecture and contemporary building designs. A place of which you can always smell the waft of sizzling food, Melbourne is a multicultural hub and is home to a diverse range of people. This vivacious variety of cultures and individuals being truly a testament to Melbourne's lively atmosphere. I interviewed Huy Truong, a successful businessman and a refugee advocate with a passion for change. He was recently a panelist on Q&A and was posed with the question of whether refugees were social welfare dependent.
Go ahead.
Okay. Australia is in debt up to its eyebrows. We've got no possibility of paying it off anywhere within the foreseeable future. The refugees that we get are, well, not likely to be, they are likely to be welfare dependent for a long time into the future, if not permanently. Where are we to get the money and the resources to look after the current refugees and any future refugees?
All right, we'll start with you.
Terry, thank you.
Taxes lately?
Thank you for that assessment. Look, clearly when you read some of the reports, there are refugees, like every segment of the population, who have either temporary or on a medium-term basis dependent on some welfare. But certainly the people I come across, and whether it's my family or extended family, I don't think our family has ever taken one welfare check, to be honest. When we first came, Mum and Dad found a job straight away, straight after the initial settlement, and they've been working in a factory for the last 30 years. And then, I've been involved in starting 3 businesses and others, and created jobs. And yes, you might say, okay, well, that was one segment of the refugees that came from, Chinese background. I'm now involved in another organisation that some colleagues and I've started, where we're creating loans to refugees to start businesses. And recently I went out and visited 6 businesses that have all started by refugees that have arrived in the last 3 or 4 years. And I've got to say that the work ethic and the motivation to actually get ahead and come off any dependence on welfare is probably exceptional. These people working 15, 16-hour days, 6, 7 days a week, starting businesses and actually creating jobs. So far from perhaps being a long-term drain on Australia's budget expenditure, I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that certainly, if not in the immediate generation, then certainly in the next generation, that the GDP is a net positive GDP contributor.
Huy Truong was an incredible guy with an equally incredible story. We got talking and decided to sit down at a local bistro called La Luna so we could chat over lunch.
That way.
Yeah, then I'll talk to you that way. So I left Vietnam in 1978. I was 7 at the time, and this was post the Vietnam War. And my father was, we're from Chinese heritage, and my father was in business in Vietnam and was, supporting the South to win the war. And when the North won, the communists won, they came and confiscated all our family's business, house, and we're starting to send my father's peers to re-education camps. And so that's when we knew we had to leave the country at that point. So you couldn't exactly just fly out of the country. So my father, my parents actually met up with another family who were a fishing family that also wanted to flee the country. And so we literally escaped in the middle of the night, went down to, we lived in the capital of, called Ho Chi Minh, or back then it was Saigon. and we went down to the country in the middle of the night, and then from there took a little boat out to in the middle of the Mekong Delta, and sailed from Vietnam down through Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and then tried to get across to Australia. And we tried 3 times, but the boat was actually just taking in too much water and was starting to sink, so the captain turned around. There was 41 of us on quite a small boat, and in the end, my dad wrote a letter to the Australian Embassy in Indonesia, and then from there we got accepted into a refugee camp, got processed there, stayed there for 3 months, and then came out to Australia. You know, it was actually quite positive. I think in large part because we knew that we were there to get assessed and then ultimately processed to go to either Australia or Canada or America, and so there was a lot of optimism. The camp itself was very basic. You know, I think we lived in effectively huts. We had some basic food, but I think the main reason was positive. It was a good experience because we had hope to get to another country. So I had 2 older sisters and 1 younger brother. So it was, my older sister was 9 and 8, I was 7, and I had a younger brother who was 3 at the time. It was really difficult for them. They didn't really have the language or the networks to really integrate in Australia well. But one thing, so most refugees who come tend to then stick around their local community with other people, whether it be from Africa or parts of Asia. But my dad chose to move out to a suburb where it was all largely Anglo-Saxons, and so we had to learn to speak English very, very quickly. And so within, I think, certainly 12, 24 months, 2 years, I think the kids were fairly well integrated. Well, I think in the most fundamental ways, I think the first way is that we were at least living in a country where my parents weren't going to be persecuted. Secondly is that through hard work you can actually build a life for yourself, so a good education, and then ultimately get a good job and build up a life here that's been wonderful. So Australia, with things like its democracy, democratic system, with a strong legal system, with equality of opportunity, it's been terrific for our family. So can I share with you my first day at school, which is probably about a month after we landed and came to Australia. So I went to a school where my sisters and I were the only Asians in the whole school. And so my mother had dressed me up in sort of in Asia, you often wear matching tops and bottoms. And so I had a matching pair of pants and top and went to school. At lunchtime, my mum had packed me some stir-fried noodles, and I had a name that people couldn't really pronounce, and I looked different. So on that first day, I opened up my lunch. I was a kid who had a funny name, who looked different, who wore pajamas to school, and ate smelly noodles, which the kids, at the school that I went to had never seen before. Whereas now you go to most schools and it's like walking into the United Nations. There's people from every different walk of life and countries, and the food is so, so many different cuisines now in a playground where kids are bringing sushi rolls or spring rolls or pasta or whatever. But back then it was very different. It's a great experience. You know, I think going from high school to university for anyone who has that experience is an amazing change, because you go from wearing a uniform and structured classes to going to a university where, you know, no one's going to tell you what to do. You can choose either 10 lectures or not attend lectures, so the learning is very, very different. And Harvard obviously was a very special place to go to, not only because of the reputation of the university, but it's the mix of people who go there. Again, it's very international, and lots of people from different backgrounds and jobs. So you learn as much from the other students as you do from the professors themselves. It's a good question. With quite a lot of luck, with support from people I've worked with and worked for along the way, and probably most important of all is being in a country where if you are willing to work hard, that you can actually you know, create a career for yourself or build businesses. You know, very few countries around the world where it doesn't matter whether you have just arrived as a refugee from a boat or whether you're a seventh generation, you know, sort of from a wealthy family. As soon as you get into the school ground or into university or into a work environment, ultimately it's about whether you work hard and whether you can make a contribution, and that's the great thing about being in Australia. Quite a bit. It wasn't malicious racism. It was just kids being kids, so you know. But it's interesting. Once I became good at sport and played football and cricket and did all the things that the Australian kids did, then all of a sudden all sense of race and colour fell away. It was, you know, I was a Richmond supporter, or I was a, you know, left arm bowler, and I've played football, and so things like sports and is a really great way to overcome, you know, racial boundaries. So, but certainly now a lot of that racism is gone. You know, I can't recall the last time I had a racist taunt, you know, for spent a number of years. So, you know, again, that highlights how far Australia's come.
Well, I think we need to firstly achieve what Labor wants to achieve, that is resettlement of the present refugees and asylum seekers on Manus and Nauru. My personal view is that we have not addressed this issue sensibly. We've not been free to advocate in the community for the rights of refugees and asylum seekers. There's been fear and suspicion. This has been used as a wedge by political parties against each other. This started with the Tampa crisis in 2001. I don't think we should demonise refugees or asylum seekers, but I accept that there have been errors in the past with opening our borders.
I think we'll be absolutely and utterly ashamed of what Australia has become. I do not believe this is in concert with the Australian spirit, and I think that history will show that the decision we took in that Abbott, well, actually it started in the Labor government and was strengthened during the Conservative government's rule. I think we will be ashamed.
This is a human heart. We all have one. And it means that we are living, that we have the will to live, to breathe another breath, So what makes anyone else any different? Everyone wants to survive. We have blood in our veins and a thumping heart. We must come together to find a compassionate way to help our fellow humans. This isn't 65.3 million people in need. This is humanity hanging in the balance.